continuous coverage of the crisis in Ukraine, and we've also shown a detailed report, in fact, of the situation at present in Ukraine. What is your understanding of the conflict, of the war in Ukraine? On one hand, the two sides are at the talking table, but again, Ukraine says that Russia still has the same demands with which it started the war with. Your reading of the situation at present, where is it leading to?
Thank you. I think two things fundamentally have changed. One, that no one in the world perhaps expected this violence to continue as long as it has. Today is the eighth day.
Yes.
And second is how President Putin began this conflict in terms of using it to seek written security guarantees from NATO and United States. But instead now this has kind of got limited to talks between President Zelensky and his team and President Putin and his team.
Yes.
So apparently the initial urging that President Putin was doing, that Ukrainian armed forces should lay down weapons, should surrender, should remove President Zelensky from power, those issues apparently are now no longer the focus. Perhaps focus now is in terms of both sides trying to ensure that their position, at least in their respective domestic constituencies, becomes agreeable. And particularly, it seems that President Putin wants to make sure that he had initially started with very, very large, sort of extraordinary aims and objectives. But now, at least, I think he would like to make sure that a kind of buffer is still carved out. And maybe President Putin, at the least, would expect to ensure that Russian forces are not forced to leave Ukraine immediately. In fact, Pentagon has just started talking about this conflict, something that could continue for as long as 10 years. So you could see like it has happened in Moldova, Georgia, Crimea, that Russian forces could stay here and that negotiations could prolong. But immediately the focus of talks obviously has to be on some kind of a ceasefire, which I think both parties, not just Ukrainians, but even Russians, perhaps need, because their constant onslaught has not really been very effective on the ground so far. So they would maybe also, like to recalibrate, even if they want to push their agenda forward from both sides. So some kind of relief, and that could, also allow people to leave Ukraine, those who are wanting to leave Ukraine, both Ukrainian and foreign nationals. But apparently talks have moved to, relatively specific issues, perhaps. Particularly hopeful because this is the continuation of talks. It's not one talks and came to naught, and then they said, we are going our ways, we are not talking anymore. But both sides apparently are, beginning to talk to each other. That means they sort of think that they can engage each other. Particularly, President Putin is willing to engage President Zelensky and his team. So in that sense, it's a little sign of both sides either feeling the fatigue or feeling that they need to really recalibrate, reinforce their positions, or find some kind of a sort of a stability on the ground, if not resolution on the ground as of now. So in that sense, you can notice Russia's focus.
So this is what perhaps also the US president mentioned when he was giving his State of the Union address, when he said that Putin has miscalculated the war and he did not expect Ukraine to put this defiant stand, and also how the world powers together have backed Ukraine. Having said that, what is your reading of, what does it leave Russia with? Having earned the wrath of the international world, having put to stake what the situation brings it with it, what is it that Russia would eventually get from here?
I think Russia felt if one was to read reports coming from TASS, news agency, or RIA Novosti, they were feeling kind of pushed to the wall, because if Ukraine joins NATO, then you could see NATO forces being deployed, right up to the borders of Russia. And then that was their concern, that they should make sure that Ukraine is, never allowed to join NATO. Indeed, Ukraine has also now put in its application for joining European Union here. So that was the compulsion that President Putin had in, sort of first giving recognition to those small people's republics carved out of the eastern part of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk people's republics. But it has really expanded much more. One was not really anticipating in the beginning that Putin will go as far as much of eastern Ukraine, east of Dnipro River in that sense. Because his earlier examples, whether in sort of Moldova or Georgia, have been to stay in a very limited terrain, which is where the rebel forces would be operating and stand in support of them as peacekeeping forces. And then, of course, Crimea was slightly bigger case. But this, again, is, I think, in that sense, still bigger case of Putin every time going out and doing sort of bigger military operations than before. But apparently, this restriction of keeping, all the attacks to east of Dnipro River is something which Putin shows having had certain restraint. But as you said, this whole world opinion gradually is now evolving against Russia, and particularly against President Putin. And UN General Assembly voting is a great example of how
Yes.
large number of nations now are beginning to take one side. And I think that is making Putin speak to President Zelensky instead of insisting that he will still only talk to United States and NATO and would like written guarantees and all that kind of initial aims and objectives that they had even issued a kind of a draft treaty
Right.
to be signed. But now I think they are also becoming far more pragmatic, knowing that the hit on their economy is going to be severe because of all these sanctions being levied, but much more on the prestige of President Putin. So I think at this stage could be where I think particularly President Putin and even to some extent President Zelensky could be focusing on what we call face-saving kind of exit from such a deadlock between the two. And the talks, therefore, I think is a good sign that talks are continuing. Of course, within the talks, both sides are still ratcheting up the conflict just to influence the other side, in pushing their agenda forward in negotiations. But continuation of negotiations, I think, is a good sign. But as far as President Joe Biden's speech is concerned, I think he's also indicated that in some sense West has not all that deserted Ukraine altogether. And to some extent now people are beginning to say that maybe covertly, if not overtly, not in open, there was perhaps enormous support in terms of both cyber warfare, information warfare, psychological warfare, etc. That is where I think Ukraine also got a certain support from Western nations. And in that sense, that may have also helped Ukraine to stay on vis-a-vis Russia. Otherwise, the asymmetry between two nations is enormous. And that is why most people thought that if Ukraine is left alone to Russia, it would not take much time for Russia to push its way.
All right,
but
Right, but in one of the press conference which UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson attended, he was confronted with the idea that the NATO allies have not done much for Ukraine except for supplying Ukraine with military aid. Added to that, also, what is your reading of where does it leave Ukraine also at present? Because NATO membership was what it was aspiring for. At the same time, the Western allies, though through their words have and through the supply of military, military aid, they have shown that they're standing by Ukraine. But at the same time, nothing concrete is happening with regard to Ukraine's ambition for a membership in NATO. What is your viewpoint on that? Is Ukraine in a tough spot?
Indeed, the Ukraine is definitely in a tough spot because President Putin has also learned over a period of time as to what he can and he cannot do. For example, this whole idea of Ukraine applying for European Union membership, in the talks, this is going to make far more, displeasure and discomfort because on ground, that membership may not happen for coming 10 years. The last country to join is Croatia. And it took 10 years for Croatia to negotiate membership of the European Union. NATO likewise will be very, very restrained because they have clearly said Article 5 can be invoked only if any NATO member is under attack. So even Moldova is not a NATO member, is a neighboring country. And in Transnistria area, there are Russian forces on southwest of Ukraine here. So, worst case scenario, one could think of East and West Germany. I hope that doesn't happen, but you could think of a scenario of East and West Ukraine, which is, I think, the worst thing that can happen to a nation like Ukraine to suffer that kind of division. But I have no idea why Pentagon has mentioned this 10 years period. So, maybe there are assessments that are thinking, that kind of division could take place. I remember on the very first day I had mentioned that the worst case scenario would be Kiev becoming Berlin of 1961. I hope that also doesn't happen. Those are worst case scenarios. But in that sense, I hope that status quo is something that they could agree upon. Ceasefire is something that they could agree upon, and then gradually find out ways and means as to how to disengage over a period of time. You can look at an example of China-India border. It takes long time to undergo disengagements when people have moved their forces forward. So that could take longer time. But if ceasefire is arranged, if stability is brought, I think international market, the whole debate about where world is going, world order is going, those things could possibly would kind of come to a halt in that sense. In cascading kind of stock exchanges suffering, investors suffering, investor confidence suffering around the world. So not only Ukraine is suffering, much of the world is also under stress in various ways. The Indian citizens are, those families are under stress here. So I think they are now trying to focus on some kind of agreeing on certain kind of status quo, ceasefire, stabilization, and then of course begin from there to talk about this.
All right, so we'll continue this interaction. Foreign affairs expert. Sir, talking of the vote, the resolution at the UNGA, though this resolution does not have a legal binding, but, on a global page, I would want to understand from you the significance of this resolution, of this vote that was conducted.
Thank you, Preeti. It has happened several times. I think it's about the 11th time that such a General Assembly session has taken place. Usually, the provision created in the charter is that in case the Security Council of United Nations is in a deadlock on a certain issue, then the matter with the procedural vote in the UN Security Council only, which means if majority of members of UN Security Council, so this procedural vote cannot be vetoed, can then convene emergency session of UN General Assembly. The mandate of UN General Assembly cannot be taken lightly because you understand the most important and most visible and most sort of around the world activity of United Nations is UN peacekeeping. And UN peacekeeping in 1950s had begun not because UN Security Council passed any resolution, but there was a provision in the charter to create a military affairs committee, which could not be created because, we had moved into Cold War and Russia was on another side of the divide. China was not yet a member of United Nations. So that was the first great example of, resolution was passed in UN General Assembly. And that led to creation of UN peacekeeping, which is now the most significant activity that United Nations does. So it is gauging the world public opinion, and that creates a mandate itself. And the kind of mandate that General Assembly is giving now to, ensure that United Nations intervenes in terms of providing help, in terms of ensuring talks, and also in that sense calling President Putin and Russia to be the ones that have ingressed into Ukraine. So that global opinion is clearly reflected in this resolution of UN General Assembly, which is very significant in reflecting where all the member nations wish United Nations to intervene. At the same time, you see, that is the mandate which would then perhaps make other major powers also to take greater interest, go and convince their domestic constituencies President Biden, for example, who was earlier talking of $360 million of aid to be provided to Ukraine, is now seeking, I think, about $10 billion of money to be raised in the United States and Congress to approve it to sort of go and help Ukraine. So in that sense, likewise, you see French president is again directly in conversation on phone with President Putin. Zelensky is talking to South Korean President Moon Jae-in. So General Assembly creates a momentum in that sense, creates a mood in that sense, and showcases as to which side of this increasing divide between Russia and Ukraine is to be taken, and who will be supported in what way and then how. And that is why I think important to understand here is that Russia realizes this kind of rising tide of global opinion, which is going to
All
encourage
right.
major powers, and therefore is sort of making its aims much more practical. It's not saying I need a direct summit with President Joe Biden and it guarantees. It is now willing to talk to President Zelensky, who
Yes.
it was not even recognizing them before. So one can see that that kind of climbing down is happening on part of Russia, and then that could perhaps open some opportunities.
All right, sir. If on one hand, Russia is a strategic partner of India. At the same time, India also has strategic partners amongst the other Western countries. Having said that, India has abstained from this vote at the UNGA. India is, in the past also we've seen how the policies have been framed, keeping in mind the national interest. Put all this together, your evaluation of, or for that matter, your, reading of India abstaining from this vote at the UNGA.
Thank you. I think it's interesting to, first of all, broadly see that India has moved from non-alignment to multi-alignments.
Yes.
So today, India wants to engage and build partnerships in as many sectors with as many countries as possible. So that explains why India is friendly to Israel, but Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE at the same time. So also friendly to Russia, but also friendly with United States in that sense. So that perhaps also puts enormous pressure on India because everybody wants to make sure India stands with them. India obviously is, the second largest country in terms of population, sixth largest economy, member of UN Security Council, non-permanent member of UN Security Council. So India's voice increasingly matters, and therefore each stakeholder in the conflict wants India to support them. But of course, as you mentioned, India has stayed on abstaining these resolutions. So firmly grounding its approach to largely neutrality of what has been time tested approach of India, and that particularly is important because this conflict is a kind of a reflection of Cold War mindset where NATO is trying to expand itself enormously, reach on the doors of Russia. Russia is trying to cut out as buffer states around it to protect itself against. So in that kind of military blocks mindset, India doesn't want to stand on either side. But I think what is important today is that India is no longer the same India that India was 25 years before, and India's policy makes the difference on the ground. And therefore, you notice the language of India's approach, even at United Nations or Ministry of External Affairs here, has moved from expressing concern to talking of regret and now deploring what is happening on the ground. So one should look at semantics. India has now also added another element of saying that India would like everyone to respect national sovereignty and territorial integrity that clearly may not go very well with Moscow. Obviously, we know whose territorial integrity is under threat in that sense, and much more. India has now started sending humanitarian aid to Ukraine. That again may not go very well with Russia. India's Foreign Affairs, Ministry of External Affairs today rebutted the statement from Russia saying that Indian students were held hostage by Russians.
Yes.
That again may not go very well with Russia. And in that sense, that traditional policy of neutrality is clearly becoming far more proactive, and with that kind of sort of more pragmatism and proactive approach is where Indian Prime Minister is going to join today the Quad Leaders Summit. And in Quad
Yes.
Leaders Summit, obviously, because other three are alliance partners and India seems to be an outlier, they would like to convince India to join them in imposing sanctions and sort of denouncing President Putin, which India may not do. But this interpretation and proactive approach of India's neutrality, I think, is going to be a good start for India to explain in That
All right.
could also create opportunities for India potentially offering to, good offices to resolve the conflict in long run, because country which is possibly acceptable to much of the greater
Right,
country,
sir.
great power.
I'll ask you to be with us, stay with us, but at present, Mr. Professor Swaran Singh. Professor, your reading of the days ahead. To what extent will this war, have a bearing on the geopolitical equations, and how far will it somewhat alter the world order, if I may say so, and also, the immediate repercussions. How do you read this?
I think it has multiple lessons as to how world order is shaping and will be shaping in coming times. One could look at from one perspective and say, oh, should you be depending on Western allies, or should you be a little cautious in depending on these Western allies? One could also see the opposite of it, saying that Western allies would help you stand firm and covertly maybe assist your operations and also ensure that they don't just take over the activity themselves, but let Ukrainians feel the pride, covertly being supported by West, as if this was their war and it was they standing against a big power like Russia. One could also talk about how this could, for example, embolden other countries. China could be an example of pushing countries in the periphery where it thinks it legitimately wants to claim certain territories. This could embolden China in that sense. It could also be a more interesting debate now.
Yes.
International Atomic Energy Agency has just passed a resolution saying that Russia must not, sort of brandish this nuclear threat, and that is a threat to humanity. Human Rights Council has just passed another resolution saying that brandishing of nuclear threat is impacting the
Yes.
basic human rights. But remember, Ukraine was one country that had inherited nuclear weapons and technologies,
Right.
establishments, facilities, and it was made to give it up in
Yes.
1994 by security guarantees given, among others, by Russians. Now,
Okay.
it could also have lessons for aspiring nuclear weapon states like Iran, for example. Should they, push that agenda forward and justify their pursuit for nuclear weapons, because that will make sure that they're not being pushed around. So there are multiple sort of issues that are going to come out in debate on how international order is being impacted and how it will be impacted in coming times.
All right, sir.
But that's for longer, I suppose. I think immediate issue on the ground is to achieve ceasefire.
Ceasefire. All right. We'll end it here. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us this evening.